And when the villagers reached out to lift him, he realized something profound. Not everything sacred shines from far away. Some constellations bloom beneath our feet. This is the story of Orion, a man who looked up his whole life, but only truly saw when he finally looked down. In a quiet coastal village nestled between the mountains and the Aegean Sea, there lived a man known to the townsfolk only as Orion Ward. He was not a fisherman like his father, nor a carpenter like his uncle. Orion was a sky watcher, a self-taught astronomer, enamored not with the world beneath his feet, but the stars that burned silently overhead. Every evening, as the last hues of orange and violet faded from the sky, Orion would rise from his modest, whitewashed home and climb the rugged hills just beyond the village. He carried only a satchel filled with hand-drawn star charts, a rusted compass, and a journal. While the villagers gathered around outdoor tables to share warm bread and laughter, Orion wandered further into solitude. His home reflected the minimalism of his lifestyle. A single bed tucked into a corner, shelves filled with books about celestial mechanics, and an aging telescope positioned at the open window. He had no dining table, no guest chairs, no guests. Meals were sparse and functional. Days passed in silent sleep, and nights in study. He believed that life's true purpose lay beyond the Earth's surface. He watched for patterns in the stars, traced the orbits of distant planets, and noted the shifting shapes of constellations. There was a kind of peace in it, a divine order he felt the world below lacked. Orion believed that humanity was simply a passing dust, while the cosmos remained eternal and wise. One evening, the village lay cloaked in the hush of approaching rain. Orion set out as usual, ignoring the rising wind that stirred the olive branches. He focused intently on the sky, walking a narrow trail leading to the cliffs. As he studied the dance of Polaris and Vega, his foot struck an unseen root. In a graceless fall, he tumbled to the ground, his journal flying from his hands and sliding into the mud. Before he could recover, a gentle voice pierced the night air. "You all right there, Orion?" It was Clara, a school teacher who lived in the village's eastern edge. She'd always found Orion strange, but not unkind. She extended a hand, her lantern casting a soft glow on his muddied face. "I'm fine," he muttered, brushing the dirt off his robes. Clara tilted her head. "Looking at stars again?" "Always," he replied. "They're where truth lives." Clara helped him to his feet. "Truth also lives here," she said, gesturing to the village below. "In bread shared, in gardens tended, in eyes that meet yours." Orion paused. No one had spoken to him that way before. As they walked back down the hill in silence, something stirred in him, a question he couldn't yet name. That night, he lay in bed unable to sleep, not because of the storm, but because of what Clara had said. Was it possible that in his pursuit of the heavens, he had forgotten the beauty of the earth? Morning arrived with an unfamiliar hue for Orion. The rain from the previous night had cleansed the air, leaving behind the scent of rosemary and wet soil. The village was slowly coming alive. Distant chatter, the clatter of cookware, the occasional bark of a dog. For once, Orion was awake to witness it all. Instead of retreating into slumber like he usually would, he found himself drawn to the window. The light didn't hurt his eyes. In fact, it painted the world in new strokes. Children ran barefoot past his garden, their laughter like music. A baker across the square pulled golden loaves from a clay oven. A woman poured water into her herb boxes, humming a folk tune under her breath. Orion stepped outside barefoot, still in his night robe. The earth was cool and damp beneath his feet. He walked without aim, as if led by something softer than logic. It was Clara who saw him first. "Look who's up before sunset," she teased from her porch, sipping something from a clay mug. He approached her slowly, unsure of the proper way to respond. Her presence was grounding. He glanced at the drink in her hand. "Coffee?" she offered, bitter and beautiful, like truth. He accepted a second cup. It was hot, slightly burned, but oddly comforting. Clara sat on the steps and patted the space beside her. "Sit, watch the village. You might learn something the stars can't teach you." And so he did. They sat in silence, broken only by the sounds of life, the creak of a wagon wheel, the flapping of laundry, the cooing of doves nesting on nearby rooftops. Orion felt like he had stepped into another dimension, one he had always dismissed as irrelevant. "There's a rhythm here," Clara said, "like a heartbeat." Orion nodded slowly. "I've only ever listened to the rhythm of the spheres. Both are worth hearing," she said with a smile. Later, she invited him to join a few neighbors for breakfast under a pergola draped with vines. Orion hesitated. His natural instinct was to retreat, but something quiet within him urged him forward. The table was covered in cloth patterned with constellations, perhaps Clara's doing. On it sat platters of olives, feta, honeycomb, and fresh tomatoes sliced into wedges. The villagers greeted him kindly, without judgment. They offered him food. He took it, cautiously at first. He didn't know bread could be so warm, or that honey could taste like wildflowers. Conversation flowed around him. Laughter, gossip, small worries, shared memories. It was disorienting, this abundance of connection. But it wasn't unwelcome. He realized, with a twinge of regret, how long it had been since someone had asked him about his day. A boy named Elias, perhaps 10 years old, asked him suddenly, "Do the stars talk to you?" Orion chuckled, in their own way. "Then why do you always look so lonely?" The question pierced more deeply than the child could know. Clara laid a gentle hand on Orion's arm. "Maybe it's time to listen to Earth's voice, too." Orion didn't answer, but for the first time, he didn't look away either. The days that followed moved slowly, like honey poured into warm tea. Orion began to drift between two worlds, the one above him, infinite and serene, and the one around him, brimming with color, texture, and sound. He didn't abandon the stars, but he began to walk the village in the early hours before sleep, as if Earth was finally pulling him back from orbit. One morning, Clara appeared at his door with a bundle wrapped in cloth. "We're visiting Myron's garden today," she said, her eyes twinkling with the authority of a school teacher and the warmth of a friend. "Come." Orion blinked at her. "I don't know who that is." "You will," Clara said. "She's a painter, a herbalist, and the keeper of the most beautiful chaos you've ever seen." They walked together through narrow paths bordered by lavender and thyme. The village was alive with its usual rhythm, bakers brushing flour from their aprons, fishermen mending nets, and children balancing on stone walls with the fearlessness only youth allows. Orion noticed it all. Myron's home stood near the village's edge, a weathered cottage surrounded by a low fence nearly buried in green. Vines clung to the walls like old friends. Flowers exploded in unexpected places, bright orange marigolds beside deep indigo morning glories, rose bushes tangled with wild mint. Myron emerged from the foliage like a woodland spirit. Her hands were stained with soil, and a smudge of green streaked her cheek. "You brought him," she said, smiling at Clara. "I did," Clara replied. "He needs to see what grows when you're not looking up." Orion expected a lecture, maybe some parable about roots and grounding, but Myron simply handed him a pair of worn gloves. "Help me weed the iris bed," she said. "They're being suffocated." He followed her silently, crouching beside the rich, dark soil. The scent of damp earth rose around him, grounding and sweet. He hadn't touched soil since he was a boy. As they worked, Myron spoke, not in grand philosophies, but in stories, of how irises symbolize messages from the divine, of the time a toad had claimed her watering can as a summer home, of how, when her husband passed, she let the garden go wild and found that beauty sometimes comes from surrender. "Gardens," she said, "are constellations you can touch. Ever think of that?" Orion looked around. There was a rhythm here too, different from the stars, but just as intricate. Bees drifted lazily between blossoms. A breeze carried the scent of basil. Somewhere, a rooster crowed late, as if refusing the authority of the sun. After the weeding, they sat under an old fig tree. Myron served them water with lemon and mint, and slices of warm bread slathered in tomato jam. "It's sweeter than I expected," Orion said after a bite. "That's because you never expect sweetness down here," Myron replied, her eyes gentle. He couldn't argue with that. As the afternoon sun shifted shadows across the garden, Clara and Myron told stories of the town, of harvest festivals and songs sung under lanterns. Orion listened, not just hearing but feeling each word settle somewhere inside him. Myron leaned forward. "The sky is magnificent, Orion. But don't forget, everything you love about it, the awe, the beauty, the mystery, can also be found right here." He nodded slowly. His gaze drifted to a butterfly landing on the edge of his empty glass. The wings beat like silent applause. Later, when he returned home, Orion didn't open his telescope. Instead, he opened the windows and let the scent of night jasmine drift through the air. He lay on the floor beside a flickering candle and tried to remember the shape of each flower he'd touched that day. He fell asleep not dreaming of galaxies, but of soft earth, fragrant leaves, and the way Clara's laughter had harmonized with the rustling trees. The following day, Clara appeared again, as if summoned by the invisible thread now connecting their lives. Orion was already at his window, watching the morning unfold. This time, she didn't need to knock. "Put on some good shoes," she said. "We're going to the Temple of Solon." Orion frowned. "The Sun Temple?" Clara grinned. "Ironic, I know, but stay curious." They walked a trail woven between olive groves and dry stone walls, golden light filtering through the canopy of fig trees. The villagers they passed waved in quiet greeting. Orion was beginning to sense something rare and powerful in this shared familiarity, like the gravity that held stars in orbit. Something held these people together. The Temple of Solon stood on a rise just outside the village. Built centuries ago, it was a modest structure of sandstone and marble. Pillars ringed a courtyard where birds sang from the rafters, and the air smelled faintly of frankincense and sun-warmed stone. Clara guided Orion to the center of the temple, where a round skylight allowed the sun to fall directly on an ancient mosaic, depicting a celestial map fused with the seasons of Earth. Orion knelt, fingers tracing the arcs and symbols. They were not so different from the star charts he'd drawn. The builders believed the divine was found in both the sky and soil, Clara said. That what was above had a mirror in what was below. Orion nodded. As above, so below. Exactly, but they also knew you had to be present. A watcher is not the same as a participant. As they wandered the corridors, Orion noticed murals faded by time, images of festivals, sowing and harvest, the lighting of candles under constellations. There was reverence here, but not only for the heavens. The people in the paintings danced barefoot, held hands, laughed in prayer. It was worship through life itself. In a shaded alcove, they found an altar left unattended, but not abandoned. Wildflowers had been placed there recently. Clara lit a candle and handed Orion a second match. "For what do I light it?" he asked. "For what you've missed," she replied. The flame flickered to life. Orion watched it dance, humble and bright. Later, they sat on the temple steps, sharing a loaf of bread and soft goat cheese Clara had tucked into her satchel. The wind moved through the columns with a song-like whistle. "You know," Orion said softly, "I used to think meaning only came from mystery, that the stars were sacred because they were far. And now? Now I wonder if the sacred is also what's near, but often ignored." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder without a word. They stayed like that as the sun reached its peak, shadows shortening into stillness. When it was time to leave, Orion stood for a long moment before stepping off the temple stone. He turned and looked back once, not in longing, but in quiet thanks. That evening, he opened his journal, but not to sketch constellations. Instead, he wrote, "The stars do not lose their beauty when we learn to see the earth. They become more beautiful because they are no longer all that I have." Then he closed the book, walked outside, and joined a group of children playing near the well, letting the sound of their laughter fill the spaces that had once echoed only with silence. It wasn't long before the entire village knew Orion had returned, not from travel, but from solitude. Not everyone understood what that meant, but they felt it. His presence at morning gatherings, his soft-spoken replies at the market, his hands no longer ink-stained with only stars, but now with fig sap, bread flour, and oil from cracked olives. He had become, for the first time in years, a part of something. One late morning, as the sunlight began to soften toward noon, Clara arrived with another invitation. "We're going to Mira's table," she said. "She's cooking lunch for the entire square." "Mira?" Orion asked. "She's the one who sings while chopping onions and makes soup with too many herbs. You'll like her." As they made their way through the village, Orion noticed how many people now nodded at him with familiarity, not as the odd sky watcher, but as someone rejoining a rhythm he'd long ignored. Mira's home sat beside the square, shaded by a towering almond tree. A long table stretched beneath it, draped in mismatched linens, already cluttered with clay dishes and baskets of vegetables. Mira, a plump, sun-kissed woman with a voice like honey and thunder, greeted him with a firm hug. "So this is the man who forgot the earth," she teased, placing a ripe tomato in his hand. "Slice that for me. Thin." Orion obeyed, amused. He wasn't sure when he'd last held a kitchen knife. The meal came together through laughter, argument, and flour spilled in liberal quantities. There was no recipe, only instinct. Orion learned that thyme was added only after tasting, and that no one could agree on how long to roast the eggplants. When the food was ready, the villagers gathered at the table in waves. Children wove between benches with plates too big for their hands. Elders shared stories over mugs of fermented berry wine. Someone brought a lute and began to pluck a lazy melody. The entire square thrummed with life. Orion ate slowly, savoring each flavor. The roasted vegetables were smoky and sweet. The bread, thick-crusted and soft, carried the heat of the oven into his chest. Every bite was a reminder. There were things you couldn't find in constellations. Mira refilled his plate. "What do stars taste like, astronomer?" she asked playfully. Orion smiled. "Cold, distant, eternal. And this?" She gestured at the spread before him. He paused, like memory and home. Later, as the sun dipped and shadows danced on stone, Orion stood up and offered something he'd never thought to give before. "Would anyone like to see the stars tonight?" A quiet hush fell over the table. "I have an old telescope," he added quickly. "We could carry it to the ridge. I can show you where Andromeda lives, where Saturn's rings whisper." Children cheered. Adults exchanged surprised looks and warm nods. That night, they gathered again, this time on the hill Orion had once kept for himself. But now, blankets were unfurled, lanterns lit, laughter rose into the cool night air. Orion unpacked the telescope like a sacred relic. He adjusted its legs, wiped the lenses, and turned it toward the heavens he had once hoarded. One by one, he guided hands, small and calloused, wrinkled and young, to the eyepiece. "That's Vega," he'd say. "Jupiter, look for the stripes. There, see that faint smudge? That's a galaxy, millions of stars in a breath." But this time, he watched their faces more than the sky. He saw awe, and he realized awe was not the property of the stars. It was the right of every soul that dared to look. As the night deepened, some dozed, others whispered. But Orion stayed awake, stretched on the ground, eyes half open. He was no longer a man torn between sky and soil. He was both. The morning after the stargazing gathering, Orion woke not with the usual longing for the stars, but with a strange craving for stillness. Not the sterile silence of space, but the kind that hums softly beneath leaves and flows beside riverbanks. He had shared his world with the village. Now he wanted to see theirs. Clara met him near the village bridge, where a path of river stones followed the water's edge toward the eastern woods. She carried a satchel, and in it, 2 apples, a wooden cup, and a folded cloth. "There's something I want to show you," she said. "A place I go when I need to remember who I am." They walked in silence, the kind that didn't demand to be filled. Around them, the world was fully awake. Birds flashed like brushstrokes between trees. The river muttered ancient stories against polished stones, and sunlight moved like golden silk across ferns. Eventually, the path opened to a quiet clearing where the river widened into a glassy pool. Moss-covered rocks ringed the edge, and a weeping willow leaned overhead as if listening. Clara knelt and filled the cup, handing it to Orion. "Drink," she said, "but slowly." He obeyed, letting the cool, mineral taste wash over his tongue. It was clean, grounding. "This place," Clara whispered, "has heard more prayers than the temple ever did." Orion didn't speak. He let himself feel the truth in her voice. Clara took off her shoes and stepped into the water, waiting until the ripples kissed her knees. She looked back at him with a grin. "You comin', Starman?" He chuckled and followed. The shock of cold water startled him at first, but then something softened. something surrendered. They stood in silence, the water lapping at their calves. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked. "All that time looking up?" Orion considered the question. "Not regret, but I think I misunderstood what I was searching for." Clara tossed a pebble into the pool. "And what do you think it is now?" He closed his eyes. "Belonging, wonder, meaning. I thought they were hidden in the stars, but maybe they were always just waiting." A dragonfly skimmed past them, wings buzzing like whispered secrets. Orion watched it until it disappeared into sunlight. They sat on a dry patch of moss, feet still wet, sharing apples. Clara told him stories from her childhood, the way her mother would braid lavender into her hair before school, the songs her father would sing while mending fishing nets. "You carry your people in your memory," Orion said. "Don't we all?" The rest of the day passed with the gentle rhythm of the river. They watched clouds form stories. They watched ants carry crumbs with the diligence of gods. And when the sun reached its highest arc, Clara leaned back on her elbows and sighed. "We should head back before the shadows stretch too long." But Orion lingered. He walked to the center of the clearing, where a ring of flat stones had been placed long ago by unknown hands. He stood there for a moment, then dropped to his knees and placed his palms on the earth. He didn't know what he was doing, but he knew it mattered. When he finally looked up, Clara was watching with a smile that held no judgment. "You felt it, didn't you?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "The earth remembers us, even when we forget ourselves." They walked home slowly. Orion felt something new in his steps, not heaviness, but gravity, a belonging not to the stars, but to the land that bore him. That night, he did not open his telescope. He opened his journal, and for the first time, wrote not about the constellations, but about a river that knew his name. The days grew longer, and with them, Orion's inner seasons shifted. He no longer lived only between dusk and dawn, but breathed fully with each hour, learning to be still without needing answers, and to listen without needing to observe. One afternoon, as clouds rolled in low and heavy, Clara invited Orion to join her on a walk through the forest trail behind the village. "It's going to rain," he observed, eyeing the silver sky. "That's the point," she replied. "Some truths only arrive with the rain." They passed the garden of Myron, who waved at them with gloved hands, her arms elbow-deep in soil. A few other villagers nodded from porches or leaned against trees, enjoying the air before the storm. As they entered the forest, the canopy shifted the light. It was quieter here. No bustling square, no rising smoke from chimneys. Only the rustle of branches and the crunch of their boots on wet leaves. "Have you ever fasted from words?" Clara asked suddenly. Orion glanced sideways. "What do you mean?" "Gone a day without speaking, just letting the world talk first." He hadn't. His life had been filled with written words, theories, annotations. Silence for him had been the absence of noise, not the presence of wisdom. "I suppose not," he admitted. "Then let's try it," Clara said, smiling. "No talking, not until the rain ends." She tucked her hands into her coat, and they walked on. At first, Orion felt a gnawing need to break the silence, to comment on a bird's song, to point out the moss glowing faintly on bark, to ask about the way the forest curved gently downward. But Clara's quiet presence steadied him. She was listening, not just hearing, but receiving. So Orion did the same. The wind whispered stories through the trees. Somewhere above, A hawk cried and was answered by a distant echo. A pine cone dropped to the path behind them, making them both turn. Then came the rain, soft at first, then steady. They found a small hollow beneath a wide tree, its thick canopy shielding them from the brunt of the downpour. Clara sat and motioned for Orion to do the same. Raindrops tapped a rhythm on the leaves. The earth began to exhale steam, warm and sweet. Orion closed his eyes. The sound enveloped him, not as distraction, but as balm. And in that moment, he heard it. A voice, not literal, not imagined, but deeply real. It was not from Clara. It was not from above. It was from within and below. A message, simple and clean. You are allowed to stop searching. He breathed in sharply, and for once did not resist. They stayed there for nearly an hour, bodies still, hearts open. When the rain began to slow, Clara stood, brushing wet leaves from her sleeves. Orion followed, but something in his gait had shifted. He wasn't walking away from something anymore. He was walking toward it. They emerged from the woods just as the sun broke through the dissipating clouds, casting gold across the village rooftops. Children ran barefoot through puddles. A dog barked from a doorstep. The square glistened. Still in silence, Clara placed a hand on Orion's shoulder. Then she walked home without a word. That night, Orion returned to the ridge with his telescope, but he didn't open it. He lay back on the grass, soaked and cool from the day's rain, and stared upward. He whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." And the sky, in its ancient language, whispered back. The village of Solena had a tradition, one older than the temple stones and more enduring than the seasonal harvest. Once a year, on the night when the moon was fullest and hung low over the sea, they held the festival of both skies. It was a night of lanterns and song, of shared meals and memory, meant to honor not just the heavens above, but the earth that cradled them. This year, for the first time in living memory, Orion was invited not as an oddity, but as a guest of honor. The invitation came folded in linen, perfumed with lemon balm. Clara handed it to him herself, her eyes playful. No stargazing from afar this time. You're part of this sky now. Orion stood at the edge of the square that evening, dressed not in robes of solitude, but in a simple tunic dyed the color of twilight. The square had been transformed. Ribbons of fabric stretched between buildings. Tables overflowed with dishes prepared by every household. Children carried paper lanterns shaped like stars, moons, and suns. Their laughter tangled with music. Mira waved him over with flour-covered hands. "Eat first, speak later," she ordered. He obeyed gladly. The scent of saffron and roasted garlic wrapped around him. There were fig tarts and lemon-stuffed grape leaves, honeyed flatbread, and grilled vegetables dressed in olive oil and herbs. With each bite, Orion tasted the story of this place, the hands that grew, the fire that baked, the love that seasoned. Once night fell, the villagers began the old dance. It was simple, more of a moving prayer than a performance. Circles formed and broke and reformed. The dance honored seasons, solstices, memory, and reunion. Orion stood on the sidelines, unsure. Clara found him. "You're not watching tonight." She pulled him into the circle. At first, he stumbled, 2 steps behind the rhythm. But the villagers didn't laugh. They adjusted, embraced him with glances and touches of encouragement. Soon he found the pace, and then something remarkable happened. As Orion moved in step with the others, a sensation rose in his chest, not wonder, but welcome, not discovery, but return. When the dance ended, the elder of the village stepped forward. She was small and round, with hair like dandelion fluff. In her hands, she carried a bowl carved from olive wood. "In Solena," she said, "we give thanks to both skies, the one that holds the stars, and the one made of earth, held by our feet." She motioned for Orion to come forward. He approached, heart fluttering. The elder dipped her fingers into the bowl and marked his forehead with water from the river. "You have returned to us," she whispered. Orion bowed. Later, as the celebration slowed and lanterns bobbed like fireflies overhead, Clara found him sitting at the edge of the square. "You all right?" she asked, sitting beside him. "I don't think I ever knew what home felt like," he admitted. "Not until now." She took his hand gently. "It was always here, Orion. You just needed to look down." They sat in silence, watching the village breathe, soft and full. The stars shimmered above as they always had. But now they were not escape. They were witness, and Orion, once a man of distance, now belonged to both skies. Weeks passed, and the rhythms of Solena moved forward like seasons on a wheel. The stars still wheeled overhead each night, and Orion still looked up, but not with the same ache, not with the hunger of a man trying to escape. Now, he watched the stars like one listens to an old song, a melody woven with memory and meaning. He had begun teaching, not in a formal school, but beneath the fig tree outside Mira's home. Children gathered on woven rugs while Orion spoke of constellations, of time told by shadows, of the way the moon danced with tides. But he also taught them how to notice the sound of bees in lavender, how to feel the shift of seasons and the taste of wind. One morning, Elias, the bold child who once asked why Orion looked so lonely, climbed into his lap with a drawing. "It's a sky," he said proudly, "but it's underground, because maybe the earth has stars too." Orion looked at the page, his eyes welling. "Maybe it does," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Later that day, he returned to his house, not to isolate, but to gather. He pulled old journals from their shelves, star maps yellowed with age, and notes scrawled in the dark. He flipped through them, not with obsession, but with gratitude. He kept one page, a sketch of the Andromeda Galaxy, and folded it into an envelope. On the front, he wrote, "To the stars that guided me, and the earth that caught me." Then he walked to the river. The village gathered that evening, not for a festival, but simply because someone had brought out bread, and someone else uncorked a jar of last year's wine. A lute began to play. Someone lit candles. Orion sat with Clara, his feet bare, his heart open. "I thought the stars were my only compass," he said quietly. "They were," Clara replied, "but even a compass needs a place to land." The moon rose, casting silver across the square. Lanterns flickered in rhythm. No one called Orion the Sky Watcher anymore. They simply called him friend. In the days that followed, Orion began writing a new journal. Its first page read, "The stars taught me to wonder, but the earth taught me to stay." He still watched the sky, but now he watched gardens too. He noticed the arc of children running through fields, and the orbit of a loaf of bread passed around a table. These, too, were constellations. And sometimes, late at night, Orion would lie beneath the open sky, Clara's hand in his, and say, "You know, the stars are still beautiful." To which she would reply, "So is this." And together, they would fall asleep beneath a sky that no longer felt distant. Because now, Orion had found the only truth he had ever really needed. Home is not just where you look. It is where you finally see. He searched the skies his entire life, but in the end, he didn't find answers among the stars. He found them in the soil beneath his feet, in the voices of neighbors, and in the quiet touch of a hand that reminded him, you don't have to leave Earth to discover the universe. Sometimes, all it takes is finally choosing to stay. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to remember that the sky above is beautiful, but so is the life happening right here, right now.